Excellent. Well, thanks again for joining us. We have an order of introductions. I'll make those in a moment. My name is Ben Mansky. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at George Mason University. I direct a new program at Mason called Next System Studies that is working with people all over the US and all over the world to build this new field of study. And one of our projects at George Mason University is the Next Constitutions Research Lab. A number of people here are affiliated at various campuses. And so I'm putting this up first simply to let you know that we are working to build an international collaborative on constitutional revolutions and revolutionary constitutionalism. And if you're interested in joining us, just approach me and let me know. So that's what I wanted to start off with. And I am actually recognizing at this moment that our first speaker, is going with slides, but they are here on Google Slides, so we'll go into slideshow mode. And let's see, how does it work? You know how to use Google Slides. Here we go, slideshow. Google keeps on changing the tech. There we go, nice. So I'll introduce each of our speakers at the outset, just to give you a little bit of background on them, and then when I ask them to come up, they will just get a brief introduction by name. So you have a sense of who's coming and the order here. And each of them will be taking 15 to 20 minutes. We had one of our papers, Anthony Pankey of San Francisco State University, who's not able to join us, unfortunately. So that will open up some more time for discussion, which we're looking forward to. Our first paper is coming from Dr. Daniel Lee, who is a board member of Move to Amend, which is the largest organization working for a constitutional change towards democracy here in the United States. That's how I would identify Move to Amend. He is a former mayor of Culver City in Los Angeles and has been involved in organizing for many years with peace and labor and all kinds of community projects. Seated to Daniel's right is Dr. Karis Hughes. Karis and I met at the Alternative Futures and Political Protest Conference just last year, and we've been working together with others to build this network, and it's the University of East London. Yeah, okay, very good. I was very nervous there. Remember, I have to visit sometime. And she will be presenting a paper as listed in the program on constitutionalism beyond the state in Venezuela. So very much looking forward to that presentation. And then at the left end of the table there is Dhruv Deepak. Dhruv is a doctoral student in sociology at my institution at George Mason University. And he has been involved with Next System Studies since we started it 3 years ago, and has taken real leadership in building something we call the Digital Commonwealth Project. So his remarks will relate to that and to the work that he's doing around digital constitutionalism. Finally, we have Bronwyn Morgan, Dr. Bronwyn Morgan, I should say, just to be consistent, coming to us as co-convener of the section that we are most sort of directly affiliated with, utopian legalities, prefigurative politics and radical governance, and coming to us from University of New South Wales in Australia. So we'll have some brief remarks from Bronwyn, and she may sort of guide the discussion. I might turn it over to you actually at that point. So that's it, and please welcome Daniel Lee.
So I'm going to try to not say it too much, but I am not a lawyer. My master's and doctorate are in social work, and I was a macro social worker for the most part, and really focused on child development. Just to give you a little bit more background, I worked a little bit of my other background into this presentation, but I come at this as an activist and an organizer, and really gonna just try to tell a story. Starts with this picture here. A few years ago, a friend of mine got married in Florence, Tuscany. I had the opportunity to spend some time with another friend in Rome, who I went to high school with in Florida. And the night before I met her, I came upon this, and I actually did this presentation on May Day. And, I think castle in the background is beautiful, but what I was more drawn to was this statue on the ground. And the castle is Castel Sant'Angelo. I have no idea about Italian. I don't know about that pronunciation. But the statue itself is called the Sleeping Migrant. And that deeply resonated with me. As Ben said, my background is in politics and organizing for the most part, but a lot of the organizing has been focused on climate change and environmental justice. And one of my biggest concerns over the last 5 to 10 years has been the plight of those who will be displaced and who are currently being displaced by climate, whether that be slow-moving catastrophes like drought or large catastrophes like hurricanes and floods and a lot of things. So this just sort of, like if you look me up on social media, this has been my background for 2 years because it's just been very deeply embedded in my mind. In my opinion, for the last 30 or 40 years, there have been migrants from around the world, either migrating internally or internationally, and we have not called them climate migrants, but they are. So that just, it's a really grounding photo for me. Also, I took it, I think it's a really good photo. But it's just a way to ground the conversation. And this statue has traveled around the world. Guerrilla art, the artist is incredibly interesting. I put a little bit about him at the bottom, but can share that information if you're interested. So the title of this entire presentation, of course, is Constitutionalism for the Stateless, Earth, and Children. And the stateless, I think we all know, are very broadly defined in this current moment. People are probably thinking about Palestinians, but there are also Kurds and Uyghurs and undocumented people in the United States, all who face a number of different challenges at the current moment, most of those being around exploitation and being used as scapegoats for politicians. But a disproportionate number of those are children, and a disproportionate number of reasons for the migration itself is climate disaster or the climate crisis. But what does it mean to be a stateless person? You know, you're often denied access to education, healthcare, social services. You often work at an early age. There's harassment, predatory practices. You don't have a passport, you can't legally cross. Statelessness can be passed around from generation to generation, and then there's this constant state of uncertainty, and in a lot of places, unaddressed trauma and unaddressed mental health impacts that come just from being stateless. This is more of a domestic image, but it's around like the impacts of environmental injustice and the climate crisis, which disproportionately affect communities of color and children and low-income communities in the United States, but you can extrapolate that to the global South. The impacts of the climate crisis are first felt in the global South, and many of the countries where it has been felt, the population is very young. I think a lot of us know the population in Palestine is very, very young. Most of the people, I'd say about 30 to 40% of the people there did not exist when people voted for Hamas, for example. So they're feeling impacts of things that they have no control over, just as people in the global South are feeling the impacts of climate change due to our actions in Western countries, and they don't really have control over that. You know, we have these COPs, we have these UN agreements, but we still refuse to act, and we don't face the immediate consequences, but other folks do. But you put those two things together, you know, being stateless and then also being more or less a victim of the international inaction. And I know there have been, you know, policies that have come forward domestically in a lot of different countries. Last night we were talking about China and like a lot of the things that they have done that have been a lot more profound than things that have happened in the US and the EU and other large territories that have a profound impact like Russia. But you combine the idea of being stateless and the climate crisis, and it just ends up with a whole lot of, and you know, I'm a mental health professional, but PTSD, depression, anxiety. A lot of people are suddenly migrants. They weren't born as migrants, so their entire life is upheaval. And then there's another larger group of people who have been stateless their entire life, and their entire life is uncertainty. And one of the biggest things and one of the reasons why this concerns me so much is the prejudice and the scapegoating that happens as a result. We are in a very fascist totalitarian moment in the US and in countries around the world, and migrants provide an incredibly convenient scapegoat which could accelerate the rate at which countries become more authoritarian and accelerate the rate at which fascism in particular becomes normalized across the globe, and that is a bad thing if you don't get my point there. But migrants in particular, one of the things that I brought up a lot, I was on my city council mayor during the pandemic, and there was a lot of talk about like hero workers, and very proud. We're literally the only city in the country that actually passed hero pay for hospital workers. Most of the municipalities talked about it, and then they got a threat of a lawsuit, and they pulled back, including the city of Los Angeles. But without undocumented, stateless workers in the US and in countries around the world, we all would have starved in our houses. That's just a common reality. The people who work in the fields, the people who work in like rendering plants for all types of meats, by and large undocumented. And as we found out in the US, a lot of those people are children, which is horrifying. But what has been left out of the stories around child workers and meat rendering plants across the country is that a lot of those workers are undocumented. And it goes back to them having to work at an early age to support their families or to provide extra support for their families, because often the adult workers in the family are being underpaid. Often, and I did this presentation on May Day, but I put this image in because I think no matter what country you're from, there's a uniform idea about who is undocumented. In the United States, it's usually thought that it's, Mexican folks, but it's much, much different due to a lot of our changes in immigration policy in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration. A lot of people from around the world are actually massing at the southern Mexico border, and they come from around the world. So that was just put in to really underlie the type of diversity that happens with migration. And I wanted to put this in because I feel like a lot of people think, oh, people are working in farms and blah, 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 and they get exploited, but it's a much bigger problem than that. If you know anything about the Olympics or the cops or the World Cup, you know that a lot of the improvements that happen in countries in the lead up to these large events are done by migrant workers. And in a lot of Western countries, on the left here, there's a little talk about the exploitation of Turkish and Kurdish workers in London. This is a very old article about the exploitation of Palestinian workers. This is about Qatar. John Oliver actually did a very good segment around the World Cup and the exploitation of workers, and the fact that a number of them were just not paid at all. All of this just to say, this is happening now. This is happening now without the worst effects of the climate crisis. It will only get worse. But I wanted to cover, this is from Somewhere Greener and Earthly Education. There are a couple of misconceptions about displacement due to climate. I know I spoke a lot about international migration and displacement, but a lot of the displacement is internal. People think it's moving from the global south to the global north, but most people cannot afford that. Most of the people who are moving are low income and impoverished, so when they try to move within their own countries. And they're only able to move from their country to another country with some type of sponsorship or some type of support. Secondly, there's this perception that climate migration refers to people fleeing extreme weather events. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the migration that has happened in the last 40 years is climate migration, but it is due to droughts. It's due to man-made droughts. It's due to a lot of man-made conditions that manifest over time and that aren't large catastrophic events, but are more drawn out events. And I think that's important to consider. There's a lot of language around what you call people. It doesn't really matter, in my opinion, whether it's a migrant, internally displaced, refugee, or once they get into a process, asylum seekers. The point is these people are often going to places where they have no protections, where they have no protections or where they can get into a process where they can become citizens, but that process takes a very long time. I have a number of friends, some who I've had to write recommendation letters for thank you, I got a 10, in the United States, where, they've been waiting for 10 years, they've been waiting for 7 years. Like, some have gone through the process, but it took 15 years. And the United States is probably the worst example of that, but there are similar problems in countries around the world. And this is just, I would recommend going to this because it was just a lot of great research, and I have the references in my slides. But the really big thing, and the thing that will propel a lot of climate migration, is heat. And we've seen that this year in India, the extreme heat, the extreme temperatures, the deaths from heat. Over the last few years in Europe in particular, and people along that sort of line of longitude, there have been extreme deaths because, I live in Southern California, but I'm from the South. I was used to the weather in the South where it's, 90 and it's normal and nobody cares. But a small example of which we can extrapolate is like most of the apartment buildings and homes in Southern California do not have air conditioners. It was never needed. It was normally 75 in the summer, and then around, August or September, it would go up to like 79, and that was fine. Now it's like 90 any month out of the year, and it's still fairly temperate in Los Angeles, even though the climate is changing from semi-arid desert to sort of temperate, almost deciduous forest because of climate change, and we have mosquitoes and thunderstorms now, which we did not have 25 years ago at all. But in places closer to the equator, that will mean a lot of migration just because of the health impacts and the deaths from heat. The number of people exposed to unprecedented heat has increased. India is right up there at the top. Nigeria, Indonesia, Philippines, Pakistan, Sudan, a lot of countries in the global south, which, like I said, and which we all know aren't the biggest contributors to the climate crisis, are the ones suffering the largest effects and are the ones from which we should expect a lot of climate migration. This is another point which I didn't really think about making very large, but one of the things that we need to talk about in the context of climate migration is the concept of borders and whether or not they are useful to us now. With the wave of climate migration that a lot of climate scientists are predicting, borders might be an impediment to human rights. And that's something that we should seriously consider domestically and locally. So like I said, come from activism and organizing. Basic theory of change is popular education. You have to let people know what is happening, or you have to learn from people what is happening. Then, of course, there's activism and organizing in the United States. It's marches, protests, freedom rides, protesting specific laws. But then there's the third prong, which is legislation, law, Supreme Court in the United States, Brown versus the Board of Education, Civil Rights Act, different laws that explicitly try to address more or less human rights abuses. I know we talk about it in terms of civil rights, but it's human rights in a lot of different countries. So that is what we need to do, and we need to have in context when we're talking about addressing climate migration. And the activism is happening. In the United States, there is undocumented and unafraid, 4 minutes. And the Rohingya are actively organizing for themselves. There's a lot of outside education that's happening, but there's a lot of internal organizing. The Uyghurs are organizing to make their plight known and to advocate for changes where they are. And similarly, in Congo, we hear a lot of stuff externally about Congo, but there are people on the ground organizing to try to not make Congo and Sudan the place where, we get cobalt and children die as a result of mining cobalt, but where children are actually protected. And of course, in Palestine, there's a lot of organizing for equal rights in particular. I won't get into the particulars around this, but I will say, and I will reiterate that Nelson Mandela was not a nonviolent activist for most of his life. He very much endorsed armed struggle. There's a lot of revisionist history around him, and that's something that we should consider around the plight of stateless people. And then, of course, this is the education component, like this sort of group over here, the groups that are advocating for Palestinian rights. This is a constellation advocating for Kurds. This is a civil society group that's advocating for Congo. So those two prongs are happening. The popular education front, which these groups cover, and then the activism that's actively happening on the ground. And in the U.S., there are very basic laws that, in certain states, California, Minnesota, pop out where you can get driver's licenses, you can have access to healthcare and supposedly due process if you're a stateless person. Of course, there are UN conventions on the stateless, on the Declaration of Human Rights, but I don't get into a conversation around the UN, but a lot of things are just on paper and toothless, which sort of speaks to my need, and this is just a conglomeration of a lot of things that were passed by the UN, which hypothetically should help stateless people, but in practice do not. There's a push in the United States to end birthright citizenship to make it even more difficult for stateless people, so that's something that we need to proactively address. And then this is just sort of a constellation of the states that offer driver's licenses, and some of these offer like tuition, and some offer healthcare for stateless people in the United States, and there are similar laws in other countries. And I'm almost done here, there's a need for domestic constitutional protections, and that is my real point. There needs to be multi-layered legal protections for stateless people before they are used as prongs to support authoritarian governments and a greater consolidation of fascism. This needs to be proactive. There needs to be, of course, international agreements, but there needs to be constitutional change that specifically addresses the plight of the stateless. And we need to, as I said, reimagine what borders mean. And we need to have affirmative rights that apply to everybody. One of the very small things, and I had a couple conversations about the small incremental things that can lead to large change, is a universal basic income. It's a technocratic idea, but it's one of those things that could really push back against the idea that stateless people or immigrants are siphoning funds away. If everyone has a basic level of, and the economist, I had a conversation with an economist who's very into modern monetary theory, Stephanie Kelton. She is more of an advocate for universal basic services because they are immune to inflation. And I'm a big proponent of that. But all of these multi-level protections, Constitution, UBI, things like in the United States when Trump was elected, a number of cities became sanctuary cities, mine did as well. Those are the type of things that we need to be proactive about instead of reactive, waiting for things to get bad, so that people are protected from the start. And I think I'm pretty much done. A little bit of background about me. I'm not just talking, I walk the walk. This is me being arrested in Occupy. Those 4 cops were on my back for a very long time. This is me being arrested at Black Lives Matter. They usually send a lot of cops for me for some reason. This is the person that I've worked with on the left for the last 7 years, Reverend James Lawson, contemporary of Martin Luther King Jr. He was on the ledge when MLK got shot, and he actually advised him a lot. Just to say that my background is not just theoretical. As I said, I'm a social worker. I was a mayor. I did do the Wakanda salute when I was sworn in. And I've worked at the James Lawson Institute. Aaron Bushnell, of course, self-immolated. Didn't exactly want to end on this point, but another person self-immolated around the Trump trial, and he was a friend of mine, Max Azzarello. He was dealing with some mental health stuff. He usually checked in with me a lot, and I tried to connect him to services. But we're at this point where like a lot of people recognize the crisis, and not just for the migrants, but for the people who have empathy. It's a very trying, difficult time, and I think one of the ways that we push back against the darkness is to be proactive, is to work towards those multi-level legal protections that will actually support and protect the larger number of stateless people that we will have around the country and around the world. And this is me on Insta, Facebook, and TikTok.